Hi everybody, it's Dr. Jensen, and I wanted to show you some empirical data that has to do with tactics around the world. And this website is ourworldanddata.org, which gets data from multiple sources, including some names you will recognize over here. Bruce Hoffman. Okay, so the Global Terrorism Database is a database I've actually worked with myself, which actually catalogs attacks over time. So this is a great website that pulls a lot of different things together, and specifically tactics are what we're going to be looking at here. So I will include the link for the website so you can take a look yourself. There's some descriptions about historical terrorism happening over the centuries, kind of looking at, again, that reign of terror during the French Revolution, as well as looking at terror in the Middle Eastern areas and so forth. And then it looks at, again, modern terrorism. And then, yep, there you see Bruce Hoffman again from Georgetown University. So he's, again, commenting on this as well. But there are some really great interactive maps. So this is number of terrorism incidents from 2017. And you just hover over these countries. And the United States has 65 incidents. So it's kind of in an orange area. But then you look at places like India that has 966 incidents. So when it looks at an attack is the threatened or actual use of illegal force and violence by a non-state actor to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. So it includes a lot of the things we've talked about in definitions of terrorism. It says the perpetrators of the incidents must be subnational actors, and the data does not include acts of state terrorism where the government is terrorizing its people. So we can look at Europe. Okay, so we actually don't have data for some of our countries in Eastern Europe. That's not terribly surprising given what happens in some parts of the world. Kazakhstan, yep, no data, but it's still very interesting. So France has had 41 incidents. Germany has had 27. The UK has had 122. Sweden, 18, Spain, 4, Ukraine, 61. So again, this kind of shows you different incidents in Europe, both Eastern and Western. In Russia, we've had 33 incidents. Shows you where we've seen lots of attacks in Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia. But generally speaking, in many highly developed countries, you don't see as many attacks, but in some you see quite a few, right? So Colombia, Venezuela, we're over here in South America, only 2 in Brazil. So to me, it's interesting to have a low attack country touching a high attack country, especially in these areas with Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and kind of some of these other kind of Eastern European and Eastern Asian countries. So this shows you kind of which countries are kind of in the red zone and in the orange and yellow zone. You can also slide this chart over time, and you can see starting from the 1970s, which is a very typical year to track tactics. We can actually see how terrorism has changed. So in the 1970s, we don't have data on a lot of countries, okay, which makes sense for that time period. But as we get more sophisticated in collecting data and tracking events, historically, we get to see a little bit more, okay? So this is what terrorism looked like in the 70s. We had 247 incidents in the United States, 81 in the United Kingdom, okay? So again, not as much data to work with here, but we can scroll over time and you can see, we're getting more data. We're seeing more activity in South America by 1980. We're seeing some of these things change over time. We scroll forward, getting into the 90s, and then we start seeing, boom, now we see terrorism pretty much worldwide, where it becomes a major force for change. And then we kind of also scroll around to see how certain areas have been more or less active. So here's 2009. Russia definitely had more incidents in 2009, 2010. And again, we can move forward into the current year. But it's interesting to see certain areas of Europe, North America and South America go from yellow to orange to red as we go over time. So I invite you to play with that. This is the number of fatalities from terrorist attacks, including victims and attackers who died as a direct result of the incident. Okay, so it's kind of interesting to see globally which years were the deadliest years. So one of the deadliest years was 2014. A lot of people think it was around 9/11. No, actually it wasn't. And it starts to show you, what's going on in the world. It also does some country-specific analysis. So again, here is 2001. This is the 9/11 attack. But you can see the United States doesn't have a very large issue with a lot of deaths in terrorism. But then we can go into Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, and we can see little upticks over time. Okay. Number of non-fatal injuries, so people that were injured but they didn't die. Again, this shows you kind of country-specific: Iraq, Afghanistan, China, Kuwait, Colombia, United Kingdom. It shows you where we've seen more injuries. So this starts to speak to the fact that sometimes tactically terrorists do very low-tech attacks that don't necessarily cause fatalities, but they are disruptive and people are definitely injured from them. And we've seen that change quite a bit over time. But look at this uptick with Iraq. This is absolutely crazy. Over the last 10 years, we've seen that. Terrorism after 9/11 marked a turning point in history. This began the war on terror, I should say. And this actually gives you the top 10 most attacked countries and territories from 1970 to September 11th, and then again from September 11th to 2008, and then 2012. So these show you kind of these countries. So it's not terribly surprising that we see Northern Ireland in here, especially with the Irish Republican Army, or countries like El Salvador and Peru and Colombia. Okay. Then when we see more recent countries, we don't really see Northern Ireland on here anymore, although some have predicted that that may change in the next few years with so many changes going on between Great Britain and the EU. But here we see some typical players, other players not so much, that are emerging over time. Percentage of all attacks as well. So again, here's that number of terrorist incidents. We've seen that before. Airline hijackings. The deadliest terrorist attacks in history, including the 9/11 attacks, were the result of 2 plane hijackings, and it has been tracking these since about 1968, when the Palestine Liberation Front hijacked the Israel El Al Flight 426 from London to Tel Aviv via Rome. Okay, so this starts to show you the number of fatalities and the number of airline hijackings. So these are important things to keep track of, especially for your quizzes. So let's just look at hijacking. So hijackings tended to be a lot more active in the late 60s, early 1970s, and then you can see they kind of tapered off, and they're virtually non-existent. Okay, there was only one hijacking in 2013. We haven't changed a whole lot. Okay, so the number of attempts and hijackings we see documented here. Fatalities, though, when we look at the blue line, that's where we see the highest number of fatalities in an airline hijacking, 2001. Okay, that's where we get into 9/11. Okay, and we look at kind of these little upticks. So realize that most hijackings are not necessarily successful, but these start to show you those fatalities over time. When we look at terrorism fatalities by region, this gives you a regional graph. So when we look at more today, we see that Eastern and Western Europe are kind of in the middle, where we see quite a few attacks that are focused there. We don't see quite as many in North America, but we certainly see a lot going on in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. So that's where we kind of want to keep looking. And again, this is kind of since 1970. So when you look tactically, you see a lot of things being tried in the 60s and 70s, and then you see some emergences of these tactics in the 80s and 90s, and then suddenly you have other regions of the world that are really awakening to terrorism as a means of change, and as the countries around the world change. So again, so interesting to see these fatalities really, really spike. And we know a lot of the different world events that are telling us why. Incidents, fatality, and injury from terrorist attack. This is in specifically Afghanistan. So again, just more graphs that show us some of these upticks. So right when someone told you, why are you taking a class on terrorism? That seems really silly. You can say, because it's very relevant. And these attacks still happen, and they are in some parts of the world higher than ever before. This is a graph specific to Iraq. Fatalities, non-fatal injuries, and just simple incidents. Okay. Again, when we look at the risk of terrorism and we look at kind of different kinds of people that are killed, it's interesting to see, what is the global death toll of different causes of death? Am I likely to die from a terrorist incident? Not really, okay? But it still is very scary, and it causes widespread change in society. So look, so this is children under 5. We can zoom in here and looking at kind of just children being susceptible to diseases and accidents and so forth. So they still remain very vulnerable, very fragile people, all different causes that they have. And then actually one of the biggest causes of death is really tobacco, okay? Then you have malnutrition, then you have overweight and obesity. It's kind of interesting that those two things are next to each other. You have alcohol, diarrheal diseases, air pollution, indoor and outdoor pollution, HIV and AIDS, road traffic accidents, malaria, suicide, interpersonal violence, childbirth or pregnancy-related disease, armed conflict, and finally at the bottom, terrorism. So people still certainly die as a result of terrorism, but again, not really in the numbers we see as our kind of global killers. Okay, so these are some good takeaways from motives. This is from Crenshaw's work at Stanford. We look at political behavior, logical choices that basically come from this political behavior, and these are some, I think, good takeaways. Situational factors, conditions that allow the possibility of radicalization and a motivating feeling against the enemy, certain triggers or events for action, kind of where people hit their final straw, and they feel kind of a need to act. These are the strategic aims that our terrorists are looking at, as far as looking at public attitudes, recognizing attention to their cause, and so forth. And then individual motivations, where we look at the psychology of the person, why they turned to terrorism in the first place. Is there a terrorist personality or a predisposition to terrorism? Okay, so these are things we like to track in research. This is some more information about the war on terror that you can read, and again, the internet and cyber attacks that we've been tracking as well. Does terrorism actually work? How effective is it? There are opposing views. The first says, we can influence policy and public opinion because it's effective, but then the second view says they hardly ever achieve their main objectives, and the groups are very unstable and they tend to disintegrate over time. So those are the really big views. These are two researchers I also want to introduce you to. Robert Pape, who is at University of Chicago. He is the single most expert of the Tamil Tigers terrorist group in Nepal. He's a major proponent of the view that terrorism can be effective, and he focuses on suicide terrorism. So you're actually going to be reading some of his work in a later module in this class. And he says, we do actually see that they achieve different aims. Rebel groups are both more likely to be granted the opportunity to participate in negotiations and offered more concessions when they execute a greater number of terror attacks. Max Abrams also contests an opposing point of view. Terrorism never succeeds. 28 different groups designated as terrorist organizations by the State Department says, they only achieved 7% of their 42 different policy objectives. It's strategically rational behavior, but functionally it doesn't really accomplish what it's supposed to. Also, Audrey Cronin's research suggests that terrorist groups fail to achieve their objectives, and these groups really only last about 5 to 9 years on average. And this again speaks to the film The Weather Underground, where we start to see people changing, becoming disinterested in terrorism, and so forth. So again, we have data sets from all over the world, and we've covered some of these things in methods, but these are some data sets from the RAND group, from Iterate, the Global Terrorism Database, which I've showed you in class, as well as the American Terrorism Study, and it talks about those data sets. So these are where you can access those data sets if you ever want to look at some data. They are available here. And if you want access to the American Terrorism Database, I can point you to that one on the University of Michigan website. So hopefully these graphs showed you some of our takeaways when we look at tactics, and that you can look at this website to study it further, again focusing on regions and countries around the world to better understand why we are so interested in those areas. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.